Here we are once again, not gaming on Linux Kubuntu. Instead today, we will be configuring a cheap $30 home router. I will be covering all the basic security settings and Wi-Fi settings you should have set up and explain some of the common features of your home router. This is not aimed toward hardcore network engineers, but more towards the everyday typical home router. So to begin, we will need to access our router's graphical user interface. To do this, we will connect an Ethernet cable from one of our router's switch ports. They typically have 4 regular switch ports plus a WAN port. Do not plug it into the WAN port, that's not going to work. So once you have it connected, you should see an Ethernet icon show up in the bottom right corner of your screen down here. Now my operating system is of course Linux Kubuntu, however the icon for Windows is almost identical. Now, open your web browser of choice. I'm using Mozilla Firefox, and you are going to type in the following web address: 192.168.1.1. If that doesn't work, you can also try 192.168.0.1, or on some routers, it can also be routerlogin.net. So it just depends on your router. Something to note also, if you are using a VPN like ExpressVPN or Surfshark, one of the popular ones, you will most likely need to disable it in order to access this site, because it will think you are coming in from an outside IP address rather than from your internal network. So it may get kind of confused and it won't let you access this. So here we are, we're getting prompted for a username and password. Typically by default it is something simple like the username is admin and the password is either admin or password. So let's try password, P-A-S-S-W-R-D, and that worked. So you are definitely going to want to change this default password. However, we are going to cover how to do that later on. So here we are at the home screen, and you can see our example router here is a Netgear, and the model is WNDR3300. Every make and model of router will be slightly different, but they should all have the same basic settings we are about to cover. So by default here, it starts in the basic settings tab over here. You'll notice on the right hand side of the screen in blue, there's a built-in guide that will explain all the different settings you have currently in this tab. Not all routers do this. Usually Netgear is pretty good about it. So let's go through these options on the default screen here. So the first one, does your internet connection require a login? We're going to leave that as no. Account name, we will leave as default. IP address, we will leave at get dynamically from ISP. Typically, ISPs only give static addresses to commercial businesses. And if you are using this cheapo router for your business, you should seriously reconsider. This means that, yes, your public-facing IP address will change. So if you are using remote web access, you will definitely have to keep that in mind, but we will cover remote access later on in the video. Here's where we're going to make our first change. The domain name server or DNS address. You can leave this default if you want, but I like to change it to Cloudflare, which is a free DNS and privacy respecting DNS server. And it's also very easy to remember. So the primary is going to be 1.1.1.1, and the secondary is going to be 1.0.0.1. Making this change will prevent your ISP from logging your DNS requests, which isn't really that big a deal, but privacy is very important. So we are going to make the change. And next, for router MAC address, we are going to leave this at default. So now that we made a slight change on the DNS, we'll click apply. Okay, let's move on to the wireless settings tab. This is where you can change your Wi-Fi network name, which by default on this device is Pit Boss, and that's going to be the 5 gigahertz signal, and Netgear -24-G, that's going to be the 2.4 gigahertz signal, which is kind of strange. I've never seen it laid out like this, but that's what they're talking about when they say 11N or 11G. And these are going to be the names that are displayed to your users when they attempt to connect to your Wi-Fi. You can change these if you want to something more personal, or leave them as default. It's really up to you. For mode, you can leave this option at the default, and for 11N or 5 gigahertz, it doesn't give us an option for automatic like it does for the 2.4 gigahertz. So we are going to leave it at default, which is 44 or 5.220 gigahertz. You may want to change this only if you are getting interference or if your 5 gigahertz frequency is congested, which probably won't happen since the range of 5 gigahertz is about half that of 2.4. So you shouldn't ever have to change it. But the option is there if you need to. For the 11G channel or 2.4 gigahertz, I would recommend leaving this on auto, which means that the router will automatically scan the Wi-Fi area and choose the best channel based on which one has the least activity. If you're savvy enough, you can talk to your neighbors within Wi-Fi reach, which is about 300 feet, and you can all come up with a plan of who is taking which channel. But since that is a little bit unrealistic, we will keep it at auto for now. Asking your 85-year-old neighbor to change his 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi channel probably won't go well, since he will most likely have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. You have to remember too, when you do manually change these, you want to space them out. So you don't want your neighbor to have, if you select channel 1, you don't want your neighbor to have channel 2. You're going to want to put them down here at 5 or 6 or even 11. So you're really only getting, to take full advantage of 2.4 gigahertz, you're really only getting probably 3 channels. 1, 6, and 11. These other ones in between are really, you're really not getting the full performance of 2.4 gigahertz. So you have to keep that in mind. Next is security options. It's a good idea to leave this default, which is this WPA PSK TKIP plus WPA2 AES. This router doesn't have WPA3 yet, which is the newest standard. You absolutely do not want to use none or WEP. None basically means your Wi-Fi is free and open to anyone, and WEP is an extremely old and insecure authentication protocol. So as long as you stick with one of these 3 down here, WPA, and preferably WPA2, you should be fine. Next is the password for your Wi-Fi, or in this case, it is a passphrase. This is a decent password, however, I would still recommend changing it to something more complex and random. To do this, I use an online password generator available on Gibson Research, and I will post a link to this website in the description. So let's get this password changed. I have it pulled up here. You're going to copy this bottom one where it has 63 random alphanumeric characters. Or if you want the middle one, you can change that. I usually pick this one down here, so we'll just select some of these at random. And we're going to copy and paste and click apply. Okay, that was a little slow, but it got changed. Next is logs. Our router is pretty much brand new, so it will not have any logs, but this will usually show failed admin login attempts or potentially malicious behavior. So it's a good idea to check this periodically. Next is block sites. This is where you can set up your router to block access to websites you don't want people on your network to access. This is usually going to be illegal, pornographic, gambling websites, or even gaming websites. As an example, let's try blocking a few websites based on keywords. So let's try blocking keywords porn, add keyword, gamble, add keyword, and just to try an actual website, let's try www.google.com. And add keyword. So we have added those, and down here is where you can still allow an admin or adult to access those restricted websites based on a specific IP address. So let's say our computer's IP address is 192.168.1.10, and we want to be able to access those restricted sites, so we need to change that to 10 and click apply. And it looks like that took. And one thing you have to remember here is, since this blocking is based on IP address and we are using an automatic DHCP, your IP address will most likely change. So you may want to add a static IP address for devices you're blocking, and also for your admin computer, this one here, which you just created the IP address. So we should be done with this section. Next is blocked services, which is a bit out of scope for this video, but it will allow you to block specific applications such as AIM, AOL Instant Messenger, if that even still exists anymore, I'm not positive, but we are going to leave all this default for now. Next is the Schedule tab. Here is where you can set up to block specific websites or services and you can specify on a granular level when to actually block them. So let's say we want to block websites on weekdays from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. So we can make those changes now. We're going to uncheck every day. We're going to uncheck Sunday and Saturday. And we're going to uncheck all day and start blocking. What did we say? 8 a.m. So we'll put in 8. And you have to remember too, this is based on military or 24-hour time. So that's going to be 0800. And we're going to end blocking at 3 p.m., which is 1500. So we'll make those changes and click apply. And it looks like it took. Next is email notification. I usually don't like to use this feature because you have to give your router your username and password to your personal email account. And that to me is a security risk, so we will leave all this default. Next is your router status, which just shows all your router's basic settings, and we can click on down here, show statistics, and it will give us our transmit and receive for each switch interface as well as uptime. And if we want, we can change the poll interval, but 5 seconds is fine. Next is the connection status. And since I'm not connected to my WAN, all my information is blank, but since you're going to be connected to an actual network, yours will have all this information filled out. Next is backup settings. You will want to back up all your configuration changes once you are done, just in case you have to factory reset your router, which actually happens more often than you think. Then after the factory reset, you can quickly restore from all the changes we're making here. So it's a good idea, but we're not done making changes, so we're going to have to come back later in this video once we're done. This next one is very important. Just like how we changed our Wi-Fi password, we will want to change our admin GUI password from password, PASSWRD, to something very complex. So let's go back to our Gibson Research complex password generator, and we're going to pick this for our Wi-Fi. So let's just pick a random string over here. We'll copy and paste that. And the new password and repeat, and our old password is PASSWRD. And we're going to click apply. And once you do that, it's going to kick you out again. So you're going to have to re-log in with the password you just created. And it looks like it took. Next is the router upgrade tab. You will definitely want to upgrade your router firmware on a regular basis. And this router has a nice feature where it will check for new firmware on login. So we'll definitely want to keep that checked. I can't remember if this was checked on default, but if it's not, just go ahead and check it and click apply. this locate and select upgrade file from your hard disk. Usually this is only done if you are flashing to something like DDWRT or open source, or if you want to roll back from a bad firmware install, which is extremely rare, but it could happen. I may actually have to do a separate video on DDWRT since it is an amazing piece of open source software. It can allow you to do way more than what your standard router firmware can do. It's really incredible. So I may just do a completely separate video on that. Next is advanced wireless settings. And here is where you can change some of the more nuanced and fancy settings of this entire advanced section here. So let's click on wireless settings. So let's say you don't need wireless access in your home, or you have a separate wireless access point. You can disable your wireless radio by unchecking this here, and this right here, disabling SSID broadcast. This is kind of a noob's way of thinking. They are a elite hacksaw. Disabling SSID broadcast basically only keeps honest people honest, and it doesn't really add any security to your home Wi-Fi. If a hacker is foiled by your hidden SSID, they are probably the worst hacker on the planet, and it's not really going to stop them. So we're going to leave the SSID broadcast since it makes it more convenient for our users. These next settings here, I would leave default, fragmentation, CTS, and preamble. Leave all those default, and the same thing for WPS. Here, wireless card access list. This is a good way to allow only known devices to access your Wi-Fi regardless if they know the Wi-Fi password, which is a good way to harden your home network. So let's click on setup, and here's where you will add the device name and the MAC address of the Wi-Fi network card, and you have to make sure you keep this straight. So it's going to be different from your Ethernet MAC address. The Wi-Fi network MAC address is completely separate than Ethernet, so you have to make sure you're using the right one. Next is the wireless repeating function. You would really only use this if you have something like a massive house or you're setting this up in some giant area. Basically what it does is it doubles the range of your wireless access point. This feature is kind of out of the scope of this video, and it's probably going to need its own video to go into significant detail. Next is port forwarding, and this is also out of the scope of this video, so we're going to leave everything default and keep on going. Next is WAN setup. I would recommend leaving all these options at default. You do not want to disable your SPI or stateful firewall. Next is LAN setup, which is your local area network inside your house. Here you can change your router device name and change your router subnet and IP address range. This is usually a good idea. As you can see, by default we have 252 IP addresses in our network, which is a bit ridiculous unless you live with 20 people that each have a phone and multiple computers. I like to change the ending IP address to something more reasonable, like 52. That will give us 50 usable IP addresses, which should be more than enough for most families. If you ever do run into an issue where you are running out of IP addresses, you can always come back in here and bump it up. Now, if you want to manually add IP addresses, this router allows that. So we can click and manually add the devices, MAC addresses and IP addresses, and host name. Next is QoS, or quality of service. I don't recommend changing these options. It can give you a little more network performance in certain applications, but for most people, leaving these default will be just fine. Next is dynamic DNS and static routes, both of which are out of scope for this video, so we're going to leave everything default and move on. Next is remote management. You do not want to turn remote management on, so do not check this box. For the average user, there's no reason you would need to remotely manage your home network. Enabling this will only paint a target on your home IP address, and like I said before, your IP address will most likely change, which makes it really confusing because if you're accessing your router remotely, you need to know the public facing IP in order to access it. And if it randomly changes, you're going to be locked out of it anyways. So let's keep on going. Next is UPnP, or Universal Plug and Play, and we do not want to have this turned on, which most places it is by default. So we are definitely going to uncheck this and click apply. But other than that, that is going to take care of all our tabs here. So we are going to return to backup settings now that we've made all our changes that we want. And of course, this is going to save our butts if we ever have to factory reset our router. We won't have to redo all of our work. So let's click backup. And as you can see, it automatically downloads the .cfg file in your browser. So now we have the config file changed. So if we ever have to factory reset, we just go to here, click restore. We're going to select that same .cfg file. So that's it for this video. It's a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but I've never seen anyone make a video like this, at least, where they go through the individual settings of a router for, an average home person. So I figured maybe it'd be useful to some people. So that's about it. Thanks for watching.